Sometimes the most extraordinary inventions are born from the most desperate love. When struggling single father Emmanuel Ford meets 8-year-old Sophia Chen outside a rundown auto repair shop in Millfield Valley, neither of them knows that their chance encounter will lead to humanity's first flying wheelchair, and ultimately put Sophia's billionaire mother, Dr. Victoria Chen, in the pilot seat of a space shuttle. This is the story of how a mechanic with calloused hands and a broken heart changed the laws of physics, transformed a family torn apart by tragedy, and proved that love really can make miracles take flight. Before we dive into this incredible journey, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from around the world. And if this story moves you, and trust me, it will, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have something even more mind-blowing to share with you. Morning of October 15, 2019, started like any other ordinary Tuesday in Millfield Valley, a forgotten industrial town nestled between the rolling hills of Northern California. The morning fog hung low over the valley, wrapping around the abandoned textile factories and empty lots that had once been the heartbeat of a thriving community. But economic downturn and corporate relocations had left Millfield Valley a shadow of its former self, where dreams came to die and people learned to survive on hope deferred. Emmanuel Ford had been surviving on hope deferred for exactly 3 years, 7 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. The 34-year-old single father had been marking time ever since the accident that changed everything. The drunk driver who ran a red light, the twisted metal, the hospital machines, and the devastating moment when doctors told him that his daughter Maya would never walk again. Maya, his brilliant, laughing, dancing 5-year-old Maya, who used to spin around their tiny apartment living room pretending to be a ballerina, would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. NBUT, the cruelest blow hadn't been Maya's paralysis. It had been watching his wife, Dr. Victoria Chen Ford, slowly disappear into her work. Victoria, the brilliant aerospace engineer who had been developing revolutionary propulsion systems for NASA, couldn't handle the guilt of not being there when the accident happened. She'd been at a conference in Houston, presenting her latest research on ion drives and atmospheric flight dynamics, when the call came. The woman who could design spacecraft that touched the stars couldn't figure out how to hold her broken family together. NTHE divorce papers had been filed 6 months after the accident. Victoria had moved to Cape Canaveral to head up NASA's newest deep space exploration program, sending monthly support checks and birthday cards, but never visiting. She'd left behind a daughter who asked every night why mommy didn't love her anymore, and a husband who couldn't explain that sometimes people run toward the stars when they can't face the earth beneath their feet. Emmanuel had been forced to close his custom motorcycle shop, the one where he'd built championship-winning racing bikes and vintage restorations that collectors drove across the country to buy. Maya's medical bills, the specialized equipment, the accessible housing modifications, and the therapy costs had drained their savings faster than water through broken pipes. Now he worked as a general mechanic at Riverside Auto Repair, a grimy shop owned by Frank Delacroix, a hard man who paid minimum wage and complained when Emmanuel spent lunch breaks on the phone with Maya's physical therapists. NTHE irony wasn't lost on Emmanuel that the man who had once built machines that could fly around racetracks at 200 miles per hour was now changing oil and replacing brake pads to pay rent on a ground-floor apartment with wheelchair ramps. His hands, which had once crafted custom exhaust systems and precision-tuned engines, now spent their days covered in the grime of other people's broken-down dreams. Maya Ford was now 8 years old, and in the 3 years since the accident, Emmanuel had watched his daughter's spirit slowly dim like a light bulb losing power. The girl who had once danced and laughed and climbed everything in sight had learned to navigate the world from the height of a wheelchair seat. She'd adapted remarkably well, too well, Emmanuel sometimes thought, watching her accept limitations that broke his heart. She'd learned to reach things on low shelves, to navigate curbs and doorways, to ask for help when she needed it. But she'd also learned to stop asking for things that seemed impossible. The specialized pediatric wheelchair that insurance had provided was functional but basic. Manual wheels, standard frame, designed for indoor use and smooth surfaces. Maya had never complained, not once. But Emmanuel saw how she watched other children run and play, how she looked up at birds flying overhead with a longing that she thought no one noticed. He'd caught her one evening in her room, arms outstretched, spinning her wheelchair in slow circles with her eyes closed, whispering, I'm flying, and his heart had shattered into pieces so small he wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. Emmanuel had been researching adaptive mobility devices for months, staying up late after Maya went to bed, studying everything from advanced prosthetics to experimental exoskeletons. The technology existed, powered wheelchairs with sophisticated control systems, even prototypes that could climb stairs or traverse rough terrain. But the cutting-edge equipment cost more than Emmanuel made in 2 years, and insurance companies weren't interested in funding anything they classified as experimental or non-essential. NTHAT. Tuesday morning, Emmanuel was installing a new transmission in a 2015 Honda Civic when he heard the commotion outside. Through the garage bay door, he could see a small crowd gathering around something near the bus stop across the street. Frank Delacroix was yelling at him to focus on his work, but something about the voices, the tone of concern and frustration, made Emmanuel put down his tools and walk outside to investigate. That's when he saw her, a little girl in a wheelchair, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with long black hair and the kind of determined expression that reminded him immediately of Maya. She was sitting at the bottom of a steep curb cut, her wheelchair tilted at an angle that suggested she'd tried to navigate the slope and gotten stuck. The bus she'd been trying to catch was pulling away, diesel exhaust mixing with the morning fog, and the girl was staring after it with the kind of quiet disappointment that Emmanuel recognized in his own daughter's face. Several adults were standing nearby, offering suggestions but not really helping. "Someone should call her parents," one woman was saying. "Maybe we can find a phone number," suggested another. But the girl just sat there, her small hands gripping the wheels of her chair, trying to rock herself free with the kind of methodical persistence that spoke of experience with obstacles that other people didn't understand. Emmanuel Ford had been fixing broken things his entire life. Motorcycles, cars, lawnmowers, anything with moving parts that had stopped moving the way they were supposed to. But standing there watching this unknown little girl struggle with a world that wasn't designed for her, he realized that some things that were broken required more than mechanical expertise to fix. They required the kind of innovation that only came from love, desperation, and the absolute refusal to accept that some problems didn't have solutions. NHE didn't know yet that the girl's name was Sophia Chen, or that her mother was Dr. Victoria Chen, the same Dr. Victoria Chen who had been his wife, who had left them 3 years ago to chase rockets and stars. He didn't know that this chance encounter would lead him to develop the world's first functional flying wheelchair, or that his invention would eventually put Victoria in the pilot's seat of a space shuttle mission that would capture the world's attention. All Emmanuel Ford knew in that moment was that a little girl needed help, and helping children in wheelchairs had become the most important thing in his world. He walked across the street, his work boots crunching on the broken asphalt, ready to offer assistance to someone who reminded him of his daughter and the dreams he was determined not to let die. What happened next would change the laws of physics, rewrite the rules of possibility, and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary innovations come from the most ordinary moments of human kindness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emmanuel Ford knelt beside the wheelchair, his experienced hands immediately assessing the situation with the same methodical approach he used when diagnosing engine problems. The chair's left wheel had caught in a crack in the asphalt where the curb cut met the street, and the angle of the slope had shifted the girl's weight in a way that made it impossible for her to rock herself free without risking a fall. "Hey there," Emmanuel said gently, his voice carrying the calm tone he'd learned to use with Maya during her difficult days. "Looks like you're having some trouble with this curb. Mind if I help?" The girl looked up at him with dark eyes that held far too much wariness for someone so young. She had delicate features and straight black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a school uniform that suggested she attended one of the private academies across town. Her wheelchair was high-end. Emmanuel could tell from the lightweight aluminum frame and precision-engineered components, but even expensive equipment had limitations when facing poorly designed infrastructure. "I can manage," she said quietly, though her continued attempts to free herself proved otherwise. The bus driver said he'd wait, but she gestured helplessly at the departing vehicle, now just a blur of yellow disappearing around the corner. Emmanuel studied the situation for a moment, then positioned himself behind the wheelchair. "I'm going to lift the back wheel slightly so you can roll forward. Is that okay?" NSHE nodded, and with a careful movement that spoke of experience handling delicate machinery, Emmanuel lifted the chair just enough to clear the obstacle. The wheelchair rolled smoothly onto the sidewalk, and the girl immediately spun it around to face him. "Thank you," she said formally, the politeness of a child who had been raised with good manners but had learned not to expect much from strangers. "I'm sorry to have caused a disturbance." NTHE formal language, and the way she apologized for something that wasn't her fault reminded Emmanuel painfully of Maya, who had developed similar habits of minimizing her needs and apologizing for accommodations that should have been automatic. It was a defensive mechanism that children in wheelchairs learned early, the art of making themselves small and undemanding in a world that often saw their presence as an inconvenience. "What's your name?" Emmanuel asked, crouching down to bring himself to her eye level. "Sophia Chen," she replied. "I go to Riverside Academy, but I missed my usual bus, and the city buses don't always, well, sometimes the wheelchair lift doesn't work." Emmanuel felt something cold settle in his stomach at the surname, but he pushed the thought aside. Chen was a common enough name, and the girl was clearly of Asian descent while his ex-wife was Korean American. Still, something about Sophia's mannerisms, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the precise way she spoke, triggered memories he'd worked hard to suppress. "I'm Emmanuel," he said. "I work at the auto shop right across the street." "How far do you need to go?" Sophia pointed down Riverside Avenue toward the newer part of town where tech companies and research facilities had established satellite offices. "The Meridian Medical Complex. I have physical therapy at 10:30, but if I'm late again, they'll call my mother, and she's—" Sophia paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "She's very busy with important work." NTHE phrase carried the weight of a child who had learned that her mother's important work took precedence over most things, including missed therapy appointments and transportation difficulties. Emmanuel recognized that particular brand of loneliness, the isolation of being someone's responsibility rather than their priority. "Tell you what," Emmanuel said, making a decision that surprised him. "I can drive you there. I've got a van that can accommodate your wheelchair, and it's no trouble." Sophia's eyes widened slightly. "I couldn't impose. Mother says I shouldn't accept rides from strangers, and besides, I don't want to make you late for work." NTHE mention of her mother's caution was sensible, but Emmanuel could see the conflict in Sophia's face, the desire for help warring with ingrained wariness, and the learned habit of not asking for too much from anyone. "How about this?" Emmanuel suggested. "You can call your mother from inside the shop while I get my van. If she says it's okay, I'll drive you. If not, we'll figure out another solution. But either way, we're not leaving you stranded here." Frank Delacroix was less than pleased when Emmanuel brought Sophia into the garage office, but one look at the little girl in the wheelchair softened even his perpetually gruff demeanor. While Sophia called her mother, reaching voicemail, as Emmanuel had suspected she would, Frank quietly mentioned that his own grandson had cerebral palsy and knew something about the daily challenges of navigating a world designed for walking. "Mothers in meetings," Sophia reported, hanging up the phone with practiced disappointment. "But she has emergency instructions for situations like this. I'm authorized to accept help from verified adults in safe public spaces, as long as I text her the license plate number and expected arrival time." The clinical way she recited the emergency protocol spoke volumes about how often Sophia found herself in situations requiring contingency plans. Emmanuel wondered what kind of 8-year-old had to memorize backup procedures for missed transportation, and what kind of life required such detailed safety protocols for basic activities. Emmanuel's van was a modified 2018 Honda Odyssey that he'd purchased and adapted after Maya's accident. The back seats had been removed and replaced with a wheelchair restraint system that he'd designed and built himself. It wasn't pretty. The modifications were purely functional, cobbled together from aftermarket parts and custom brackets. But it allowed Maya to travel safely and maintain some independence during their father-daughter outings. As Emmanuel secured Sophia's wheelchair in the van, she ran her hands along the restraint system with obvious curiosity. "Did you build this yourself?" she asked, her tone shifting from polite to genuinely interested. "Yeah," Emmanuel replied, checking the locks on her wheels. "Had to learn when my daughter started using a wheelchair a few years ago. The commercial conversion systems cost more than the van itself, so I figured out how to do it myself." "Your daughter uses a wheelchair too?" Sophia's voice carried a note of surprise and something that might have been hope. The recognition that here was an adult who might actually understand her daily reality, Maya. "She's 8, same as you. Spinal cord injury from a car accident when she was 5. NFOR the first time since he'd met her." Sophia's formal composure cracked slightly. "I'm sorry. That must have been very difficult for your family." NTHE mature sympathy in her voice reminded Emmanuel again of how quickly children with disabilities learn to navigate adult emotions and conversations. They became small diplomats, skilled at managing other people's discomfort with their situations. It was, Emmanuel admitted as he started the van. But Maya's tougher than she knows, and we've figured out how to make it work. What about you? Have you been using a wheelchair long? Since I was 3, Sophia said matter-of-factly. Spina bifida. Mother says I'm lucky that my cognitive function wasn't affected, and that modern medicine allows people with my condition to live relatively normal lives. Again, the clinical language that sounded like it had been memorized from medical consultations rather than internalized through personal experience. Emmanuel was beginning to understand that Sophia had been raised to think of her disability in technical terms rather than emotional ones, an approach that probably helped with medical compliance, but might not leave much room for processing the harder feelings that came with being different. And as they drove through Millfield Valley toward the medical complex, Emmanuel found himself studying Sophia in the rearview mirror. She sat quietly, looking out the window at the passing landscape with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was thinking about something important. Every few minutes, she would shift slightly in her wheelchair, and Emmanuel recognized the micro-adjustments that wheelchair users made constantly to maintain comfort and circulation. NTHE Meridian Medical Complex was a sprawling facility that served the entire Tri-County area, specializing in rehabilitation services and adaptive technology research. As Emmanuel pulled into the patient drop-off area, he noticed that the building's accessibility features were top-notch: smooth approaches, automatic doors, lowered reception counters. It was the kind of place designed by people who understood that universal access wasn't a luxury but a necessity. "Thank you so much for the ride," Sophia said, as Emmanuel lowered the van's ramp and began unlocking her wheelchair restraints. "This was very kind of you, especially since you're basically a stranger who didn't have to help." Sophia," Emmanuel said, finishing with the wheelchair locks and moving to face her directly. "Can I tell you something that I learned from my daughter?" NSHE nodded, her dark eyes serious and attentive. "You don't have to be grateful for basic kindness. The world should be set up so that you can get where you need to go without depending on the goodwill of strangers. The fact that it isn't set up that way isn't your fault, and you don't need to apologize for needing help." For a moment, Sophia looked startled, as if the concept of not apologizing for her needs had never occurred to her. Then her expression shifted to something that might have been relief. "Maya is lucky to have a father who understands that," she said quietly. As Emmanuel watched Sophia navigate the entrance to the medical complex with practiced efficiency, he found himself thinking about the casual cruelty of a world that expected children to develop contingency plans for basic transportation, that required 8-year-olds to memorize safety protocols for accepting help, that made young people feel grateful for accommodations that should have been automatic. NHE also found himself. The thought of his daughter navigating the world's obstacles alone, developing the same careful politeness and apologetic independence he'd seen in Sophia, filled him with a determination he hadn't felt in months. Standing outside the medical complex, watching Sophia disappear through the automatic doors, Emmanuel Ford made a decision that would change everything. He was going to figure out how to build something better, not just for Maya, but for every child who had learned to apologize for needing help in a world that should have been designed to include them from the beginning. NHE just didn't know yet that the solution would require him to reinvent the laws of physics, or that the little girl he'd just helped would turn out to be the daughter of the woman who had broken his heart and the key to putting that same woman in space. 3 weeks after his encounter with Sophia Chen, Emmanuel Ford was lying awake at 2:47 a.m. It was the 3rd night in a row that she'd woken up sobbing, and Emmanuel knew exactly what was causing the nightmares. The rejection letter from the Adaptive Technology Grant Foundation was still sitting on their kitchen table, stamped with the official seal that had crushed their latest hope for funding an advanced-powered wheelchair. NTHE letter was polite but devastating. "While we appreciate your application and recognize Maya's need for enhanced mobility equipment, our foundation prioritizes applicants with demonstrated academic or athletic achievement potential. Maya's young age and limited extracurricular involvement do not meet our current funding criteria. We encourage you to reapply in 2 to 3 years when she has had opportunity to establish a more comprehensive profile." Emmanuel had read the letter 17 times, each reading making him angrier at a system that expected an 8-year-old girl to prove her worthiness for basic mobility. Maya wasn't a charity case looking for handouts. She was a brilliant, creative child who deserved the same opportunities as any other kid. But the Grant Foundation, like so many others they'd applied to, wanted to fund inspiring success stories, not everyday children who simply needed better equipment to navigate their daily lives. Crying from Maya's room grew quieter, but Emmanuel could still hear her talking to herself in the soft, broken voice she used when she thought no one was listening. "I'm sorry I'm not good enough," she whispered to her stuffed elephant, the one she'd had since before the accident. "I'm sorry I can't do sports or win contests like the kids who get the good wheelchairs." Emmanuel's heart shattered a little more as he realized that Maya blamed herself for their funding failures. In her 8-year-old mind, she had internalized the message that she wasn't deserving enough, accomplished enough, or special enough to merit the equipment that would make her life easier. She had learned to see herself through the lens of bureaucratic criteria rather than her own inherent worth as a human being. This was the fourth major funding rejection in 6 months. The Sunshine Foundation had turned them down because Maya's medical condition wasn't considered severe enough compared to other applicants. The Children's Mobility Alliance had rejected their application because Emmanuel's income was technically above the poverty line, despite the fact that Maya's medical expenses consumed 60% of his take-home pay. The state vocational rehabilitation program had been the most insulting, informing them that mobility enhancement grants were only available for individuals preparing for employment, which apparently didn't include 8-year-olds who simply wanted to access playgrounds and keep up with their friends. Emmanuel had spent countless evenings filling out applications, gathering medical documentation, writing essays about Maya's goals and dreams, and submitting financial statements that laid bare their family's desperate circumstances. Each application represented hours of hope and vulnerability, only to be met with form letters that reduced Maya to a checklist of criteria she couldn't meet through no fault of her own. NTHE insurance battle had been even worse. Maya's basic wheelchair was classified as durable medical equipment and was covered under their health plan, but anything beyond the most basic manual wheelchair was considered luxury or convenience rather than medical necessity. The insurance company's medical review board had actually argued that an 8-year-old didn't need powered mobility because children that age should be developing upper body strength through manual wheelchair use. Emmanuel had appealed the decision 3 times, providing letters from Maya's physical therapist, occupational therapist, and pediatrician, all explaining how a powered wheelchair would improve Maya's participation in school activities, reduce repetitive stress injuries, and support her overall development. The insurance company's response had been to offer a $500 credit toward approved mobility accessories, which might cover a cup holder and some reflective tape. NTHE's most heartbreaking part was watching Maya's world gradually shrink as her limitations became more apparent. When she was 5 and newly injured, their apartment complex had seemed manageable, but as Maya grew older and wanted more independence, Emmanuel realized how many barriers existed that he'd never noticed. The playground equipment at the neighborhood park wasn't wheelchair accessible. The local library had ramps, but the children's section was on a raised platform that required asking librarians for assistance every time Maya wanted to browse books independently. School was becoming increasingly challenging as Maya's classmates developed stronger running skills and began participating in sports and activities that assumed typical mobility. Maya had started declining birthday party invitations because too many venues had stairs, uneven surfaces, or activities she couldn't participate in. She'd stopped asking to go places spontaneously, having learned that most destinations required advanced planning and often involved disappointment. Emmanuel had tried to compensate by becoming Maya's constant companion and mobility assistant. He drove her everywhere, lifted her wheelchair over obstacles, and researched accessibility features before every outing. But his hypervigilance was exhausting for both of them, and he could see that Maya was developing learned helplessness, automatically looking to adults for solutions rather than developing her own problem-solving skills. NTHE breaking point had come the previous weekend during a visit to Riverside Park, where Emmanuel had been pushing Maya's wheelchair along the paved trail while other children ran ahead with their bikes and scooters. Maya had grown quiet, watching a group of kids her age who were racing their bikes down a gentle hill, shrieking with laughter as they coasted toward the duck pond. "Daddy," Maya had said in a small voice, "what does it feel like to go fast?" Emmanuel had tried to give her some speed by running while pushing her wheelchair, but the manual chair wasn't designed for speed, and the rough pavement made for a bumpy, jarring ride that scared rather than thrilled her. They'd given up after a few attempts, but Maya's question had haunted Emmanuel for days. His daughter had never experienced the simple childhood joy of moving fast under her own power, of feeling wind in her hair, of having the freedom to go wherever her curiosity led her. That night, after Maya had finally cried herself back to sleep, Emmanuel found himself in their tiny kitchen, surrounded by the rejection letters and insurance denials that had accumulated over months of failed attempts to access better equipment. He spread the papers across their small table like evidence in a criminal case, proof of a system that was failing children who needed it most. NHE thought about Sophia Chen and her careful politeness, her practiced contingency plans, her apologetic gratitude for basic kindness. He thought about the clinical way she'd described her disability, as if she'd been trained to think of herself as a medical condition rather than a complete human being with dreams and potential. He thought about her mother, Dr. Victoria Chen, who sounded busy with important work, but might not understand how that phrase landed in the ears of a child who needed consistent support and advocacy. Emmanuel picked up his laptop and began researching powered wheelchair technology with the methodical approach he'd once used to design custom motorcycle engines. He studied propulsion systems, battery technologies, control interfaces, and weight distribution calculations. He read patents and technical specifications until his eyes burned, trying to understand why mobility devices were so expensive and whether there were ways to build better equipment more affordably. What he discovered made him angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. The technology for advanced powered wheelchairs wasn't particularly complex. Most systems used decades-old motor and battery technologies that had been refined rather than revolutionized. The high costs came primarily from small production volumes, extensive regulatory compliance requirements, and the fact that insurance companies were willing to pay inflated prices for approved equipment rather than negotiating for innovation. More frustrating was the realization that most powered wheelchairs were designed for indoor use and smooth surfaces, with limited capability for outdoor terrain or higher speeds. Children like Maya were expected to accept devices that prioritize safety and reliability over adventure and exploration. The equipment seemed designed by adults who had forgotten that childhood was supposed to include elements of risk, speed, and discovery. As dawn light began filtering through their kitchen window, Emmanuel made a decision that would change everything. If the system wouldn't provide Maya with the mobility she deserved, he would build it himself. He had the mechanical skills, the engineering knowledge, and the desperate motivation of a father who refused to accept that his daughter's dreams were too expensive for their reality. NHE started sketching design concepts on the backs of rejection letters, turning symbols of defeat into blueprints for hope. He didn't know yet that his innovations would lead to the world's first flying wheelchair, or that the solution would require him to challenge fundamental assumptions about what was possible in personal mobility technology. He just knew that Maya deserved better than a world that expected her to be grateful for limitations, and he was going to figure out how to give her the freedom to go fast, to explore, and to experience the pure joy of movement that every child should take for granted. NTHE rejection letters would stay on their kitchen table for several more weeks, but now they served a different purpose. Daily reminders of why conventional solutions weren't enough, and why sometimes the most important innovations came from parents who refused to accept that their children's limitations were permanent or unchangeable. The 6-by-8-foot space was crammed with salvaged electric motors, battery packs, control circuits, and prototype wheelchair frames that Emmanuel had been acquiring through a network of auto salvage yards, electronics recyclers, and online surplus dealers. Frank Delacroix had grudgingly allowed Emmanuel to use the shop's welding equipment after hours, understanding that some projects were too important to be stopped by corporate policies. Emmanuel's breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, studying the propulsion systems of the racing motorcycles he used to build. Traditional wheelchairs relied on two-wheel drive systems that mimicked automotive design, but motorcycles achieved superior power-to-weight ratios through different engineering principles. What if a wheelchair could be designed more like a high-performance bike than a miniature car? NTHE initial prototypes had been disasters. The first attempt, essentially a standard wheelchair frame with motorcycle wheel motors, had been too heavy and unstable. The second version had the opposite problem. Too much power concentrated in the rear wheels, causing dangerous wheelies that could easily throw a rider backward. Maya had watched these early tests from a safe distance, offering encouragement while Emmanuel muttered engineering curses and redesigned components for the third time. But the failed experiments had taught Emmanuel valuable lessons about weight distribution, center of gravity, and the unique challenges of wheelchair dynamics. Unlike motorcycles, wheelchairs couldn't rely on forward momentum for stability. Unlike cars, they needed to maintain maneuverability in tight spaces. The solution required innovations that didn't exist in any existing vehicle category. NTHE breakthrough moment had come during a particularly frustrating evening when Emmanuel was ready to abandon the entire project. Maya had rolled into the garage where he was working, surveying the scattered parts and abandoned prototypes with the thoughtful expression she'd inherited from her mother. "Daddy," she'd said quietly, "when I dream about moving fast, I don't dream about going forward like a car. I dream about flying." NTHAT's single comment had shifted Emmanuel's entire approach. Instead of trying to build a faster ground vehicle, what if he focused on creating something that could actually leave the ground? The physics were complex, but not impossible. Drone technology had advanced dramatically in recent years, with powerful electric motors and sophisticated control systems becoming increasingly affordable. If drones could lift cameras and packages, why couldn't similar technology lift a lightweight wheelchair? Emmanuel had spent the next 3 weeks researching multi-rotor aircraft design, studying everything from commercial drone configurations to experimental aircraft prototypes. The engineering challenges were significant. Human flight required much more lift capacity than typical drones, plus sophisticated safety systems and intuitive controls, but the basic technology existed. It just needed to be adapted and scaled for a completely different application. NTHE timing of his research had been perfect for another reason. The aerospace industry was experiencing rapid innovation in electric vertical takeoff and landing, eVTOL aircraft, with companies racing to develop flying cars and urban air mobility solutions. The technological spillover from these commercial developments was creating a surplus of high-performance components that Emmanuel could acquire at reasonable prices. NHI's first flying wheelchair prototype had been ridiculously primitive, essentially Maya's old manual wheelchair with 4 drone rotors mounted on aluminum struts. The control system was a modified RC aircraft transmitter that required 2 hands to operate. The flight time was limited to about 30 seconds before the batteries died, and the noise level was comparable to a small airplane. But for 30 magical seconds, the contraption had actually lifted off the garage floor with a sandbag simulating Maya's weight. And Maya had been the first person to see the successful test flight, and her reaction had validated every hour Emmanuel had spent in the garage. She'd watched the wheelchair hover 3 feet above the concrete, rotating slowly as Emmanuel adjusted the controls, and her face had lit up with wonder that he hadn't seen since before the accident. "It's really flying," she'd whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "It's actually flying." NTHE noise had brought Frank Delacroix out of his office, and the shop owner had stood transfixed as Emmanuel demonstrated basic altitude control and gentle movements. Frank had seen plenty of unusual projects in his 40 years as a mechanic, but nothing had prepared him for watching a wheelchair hover in his garage bay. "And sweet mother of pearl," Frank had muttered. "Emmanuel, what in God's name have you built?" Word of the flying wheelchair had spread quickly through Millfield Valley's tight-knit community. Within a week, Emmanuel found himself dealing with an unexpected stream of visitors to the garage, neighbors who wanted to see the impossible machine, parents of disabled children who'd heard rumors about revolutionary mobility technology, and even a few reporters from local newspapers who thought they might have stumbled onto a human interest story. NTHE attention was both encouraging and overwhelming. Emmanuel appreciated the community's support, but he wasn't ready for public scrutiny of what was still a rough prototype. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his invention might have implications far beyond helping Maya. If the technology could be refined and made safe, it could transform mobility for thousands of people with disabilities. NTHAT realization had come with unexpected complications. One morning, Emmanuel had arrived at work to find a black sedan parked outside Riverside Auto Repair. The woman who emerged from the car was Dr. Lisa Richardson, a professor of aerospace engineering from UC Berkeley, who had heard about Emmanuel's project through academic networks. Dr. Richardson had been polite but direct. "Mr. Ford, I understand you've been working on powered flight applications for disability mobility. I'm here to discuss the legal and safety implications of what you're developing. The conversation that followed had been eye-opening in ways Emmanuel hadn't anticipated. Dr. Richardson explained that personal flying vehicles were subject to Federal Aviation Administration regulations even if they operated at low altitudes. The insurance liability for experimental aircraft was enormous. The safety testing requirements for any device intended to carry human passengers were extensive and expensive. "I'm not trying to discourage innovation," Dr. Richardson had said, examining Emmanuel's prototype with obvious interest. "But you need to understand that you're not just building a mobility device. You're developing aircraft technology, and that comes with federal oversight and safety requirements that most people never consider." The regulatory reality had been sobering. Emmanuel's flying wheelchair, even in its primitive form, was technically classified as an experimental aircraft. To legally test it with a human passenger, he would need pilot certification, aircraft registration, and approval from multiple federal agencies. The paperwork alone could take months, and the costs could easily exceed $50,000 before Maya ever got to fly. Dr. Richardson had also offered unexpected hope. "There's another possibility," she'd said, studying Emmanuel's design notes with growing excitement. "What you've built here is genuinely innovative. If you're willing to work with the university researchers and follow proper safety protocols, this could become a legitimate research project with access to funding and regulatory support." The offer had been tempting, but Emmanuel was wary of academic bureaucracy that might slow down or complicate his primary goal of helping Maya. He'd seen too many promising technologies get lost in university research programs that prioritized publication over practical application, (NDR). Richardson had seemed to understand his hesitation. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Ford. Do you want to build one flying wheelchair for your daughter? Or do you want to prove that this technology can help thousands of children with mobility limitations?" The question had haunted Emmanuel for days. His original motivation had been purely personal, a father's desperate desire to give his daughter the freedom she deserved. But the more he learned about the broader disability community, the more he understood that Maya's challenges were shared by countless other children whose families couldn't afford advanced mobility equipment. The weekend, Emmanuel had made a decision that would change the trajectory of his project. He called Dr. Richardson and agreed to discuss a research partnership, but with specific conditions. The university could provide funding and regulatory support, but Emmanuel would maintain design control and ensure that the technology remained affordable and accessible rather than becoming another expensive medical device that only wealthy families could afford. The partnership agreement had taken weeks to negotiate, but the result was revolutionary. UC Berkeley's engineering department would provide laboratory space, safety testing facilities, and graduate student researchers. Emmanuel would serve as the primary inventor and design engineer, with intellectual property rights that ensured the technology couldn't be monopolized by medical device manufacturers. Most importantly, the partnership included a commitment to develop the flying wheelchair as an open-source technology that other engineers could adapt and improve. Emmanuel had insisted on this provision, remembering his frustration with proprietary medical equipment that couldn't be modified or repaired by patients and families. As spring turned to summer, Emmanuel found himself dividing time between his day job at the auto shop and his new role as a university research collaborator. The project was growing beyond anything he'd imagined when he started sketching designs on rejection letters. But at the center of everything was still Maya, still waiting for the chance to fly, still trusting that her father would figure out how to make the impossible possible. The prototype hanging in the UC Berkeley laboratory was sleeker and more sophisticated than anything Emmanuel could have built in his garage, but it carried the same dream that had started the entire project, proving that limitations were just engineering problems waiting for creative solutions. The UC Berkeley Aerospace Engineering Laboratory buzzed with controlled excitement on the morning of September 15th, when Dr. Sophia Chen walked through the security doors for what she believed was a routine consultation on experimental aircraft propulsion systems. The UC department head, Dr. Patricia Williams, had mentioned that a local inventor was developing innovative electric vertical takeoff technology that might interest NASA's Urban Air Mobility Research Program. Victoria had agreed to the meeting as a professional courtesy, expecting to spend an hour reviewing another impractical flying car concept before returning to her real work on deep space propulsion systems. NSHE had no idea that the local inventor was Emmanuel Ford, or that the technology demonstration would force her to confront the family she'd abandoned 3 years earlier. Victoria had built her new life in Cape Canaveral with methodical precision, constructing barriers between her present and past that allowed her to function. Her work as Director of Advanced Propulsion Systems for NASA's Artemis program consumed 16-hour days, and she'd convinced herself that this single-minded focus was necessary for humanity's expansion into space. The monthly support checks she sent to Emmanuel were substantial enough to assuage her conscience, and she'd managed to avoid any direct contact that might complicate her carefully maintained emotional detachment. NBUT, standing in the Berkeley laboratory, watching a wheelchair hover 6 feet above the ground with graceful, silent precision, Victoria felt the walls she'd constructed around her heart begin to crumble. The flying wheelchair was unlike anything she'd seen in 20 years of aerospace engineering, elegant, stable, and so obviously designed with love rather than profit that it took her breath away. The propulsion system uses a distributed thrust configuration with 8 independent rotors. Dr. Richardson was explaining, gesturing toward the sleek device suspended in the center of the lab. The control software provides automatic stability compensation, and the redundancy systems ensure safe landing even with multiple motor failures. We've achieved a flight time of 12 minutes with a 150-pound payload, and the noise signature is remarkably low. And Victoria studied the technical specifications with growing amazement. The engineering was sophisticated enough to rival military aircraft development, but the design philosophy was completely different. Instead of maximizing performance or minimizing costs, every component had been optimized for safety, accessibility, and ease of use. The control interface was so intuitive that a child could learn to operate it, yet the underlying technology was advanced enough to interest NASA researchers. And who designed the control algorithms? Victoria asked, noting the unusual approach to stability management that differed significantly from conventional aircraft systems. "That would be me," said a familiar voice from behind her. Victoria turned slowly, already knowing what she would see, but unprepared for the emotional impact of actually facing Emmanuel after 3 years of carefully maintained distance. He looked older. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage, and his hands bore the permanent stains of automotive work rather than the clean precision she remembered from his custom motorcycle days. But his expression carried a quiet confidence that she'd never seen before, the look of someone who had discovered capabilities he hadn't known he possessed. "Hello, Victoria," Emmanuel said quietly. "I didn't know you were going to be here today." NFOR a moment, Victoria couldn't speak. The professional composure that had carried her through congressional hearings and international conferences evaporated in the face of seeing the man she'd left behind. Standing in the laboratory surrounded by advanced technology, she realized that Emmanuel had continued growing and innovating, while she'd assumed he was simply surviving their family's collapse. "Emmanuel," she managed finally. Dr. Williams said the inventor was a local mechanic. "I didn't realize that the local mechanic was your ex-husband?" Emmanuel's tone was neutral, but Victoria could hear the complexity of emotions underneath. I'm sure she didn't think to mention it. "Not many people know about our connection." Dr. Richardson looked between them with sudden understanding. "Should I give you two some privacy to discuss this?" "No," Emmanuel said firmly. "This is about the technology, not our personal history." Victoria's expertise in propulsion systems could be valuable for the project, assuming she's interested in the work rather than the inventor. The challenge in his words stung, but Victoria realized she deserved it. She'd built her reputation on being interested in revolutionary technology, yet she'd never bothered to learn what Emmanuel was doing with his mechanical skills after their divorce. She'd written him off as someone whose dreams had been permanently grounded, never imagining that he might be developing aerospace innovations that rivaled anything in her NASA laboratory. "The control software is remarkable," Victoria said, forcing herself to focus on the technical aspects rather than the personal implications. "The stability algorithms are more sophisticated than most military aircraft systems. How did you develop the mathematical models for distributed thrust management?" Emmanuel's expression shifted slightly, and Victoria caught a glimpse of the passionate engineer she'd fallen in love with 15 years earlier. "Trial and error, mostly. I started with standard multi-rotor configurations, but they weren't stable enough for human passengers. The breakthrough came from studying motorcycle dynamics, how riders maintain balance through subtle weight shifts rather than rigid mechanical systems." And as Emmanuel explained his development process, Victoria realized that his approach was fundamentally different from anything she'd encountered in aerospace engineering. Instead of starting with theoretical models and working toward practical applications, he'd begun with a specific human need and innovated whatever technology was necessary to meet it. The result was more elegant and user-friendly than conventional aircraft design because it had been developed by someone who understood that the ultimate user would be a child who just wanted to fly. What's the intended application? Victoria asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would be more personal than professional. Mobility enhancement for children with paralysis or lower limb disabilities, Dr. Richardson explained. Emmanuel's daughter was the original inspiration for the project, but we're developing it as assistive technology that could benefit thousands of young people with mobility limitations. NTHE mention of Maya hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd been so successful at compartmentalizing her past life that she'd managed to avoid thinking about her daughter as a real person with ongoing needs and dreams. Maya had become an abstraction in Victoria's mind, a source of guilt rather than a living child who was growing up without her mother. Maya, Victoria whispered, the name feeling strange on her tongue after years of avoiding it. How is she? Emmanuel's expression hardened slightly. She's 8 years old, brilliant, and desperate to experience the kind of freedom that most children take for granted. She's been waiting 3 years for someone to invent technology that would let her fly, and she doesn't understand why her mother is too busy with space exploration to notice that her daughter is stuck on the ground. NTHE accusation was delivered quietly, but it carried the weight of accumulated frustration and disappointment. Victoria realized that while she'd been working to put human beings in space, she'd completely ignored the earthbound struggles of the human being who needed her most. I send support payments, Victoria said defensively, knowing how inadequate the words sounded even as she spoke them. Money isn't the same as presence, Emmanuel replied. Maya doesn't need a benefactor. She needs a mother who's interested in her daily life, her challenges, her dreams about flying, NDR. Richardson cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should focus on the technical review for now. Personal matters can be discussed separately. NBUT Victoria found herself unable to shift back to professional mode. Seeing Emmanuel's flying wheelchair, understanding that he'd developed aerospace technology specifically to give their daughter the gift of flight, had shattered her carefully constructed emotional defenses. For 3 years, she'd justified her absence by telling herself that Emmanuel and Maya were better off without her complicated grief and workaholic tendencies. Now she was confronting evidence that her presence might have been more valuable than her absence. I'd like to see the flight testing data, Victoria said, her voice not quite steady. And I want to understand the development timeline. When do you expect to have a version that's safe for Maya to use? Something in her tone must have conveyed more than professional interest, because Emmanuel's expression softened slightly. We're hoping for initial human testing within 6 months, assuming we can navigate the regulatory requirements. The technology is sound, but the FAA isn't exactly set up to certify flying wheelchairs. I might be able to help with that, Victoria heard herself saying. NASA has relationships with aviation regulatory agencies for experimental aircraft approval. If the technology has potential applications for space mobility systems, I could justify institutional support for the certification process. NTHE offer surprised even Victoria herself. She'd come to the laboratory expecting a brief consultation that would fulfill her professional obligations. Instead, she was volunteering to become involved in a project that would force her to confront the family she'd abandoned and the daughter she'd tried to forget. Emmanuel studied her face carefully as if trying to determine whether her offer came from professional interest or personal guilt. Maya would want to meet you, he said finally. She's never stopped asking about her mother who builds spaceships. If you're going to be involved in this project, she'll want to understand why you're here for the flying wheelchair, but not for her. NTHE question Victoria had been avoiding for 3 years hung in the air between them. Was she capable of being Maya's mother again? Or was she only able to function as a technical consultant who happened to share DNA with the child who needed her most? I'd like to meet her, Victoria said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. I'd like to see what kind of person she's become, and maybe I can figure out how to be part of her life again. NFOR the first time since she'd entered the laboratory, Emmanuel smiled. Not the professional courtesy he'd shown earlier, but something that carried genuine warmth and hope. She's going to be so excited, he said. Maya's been waiting her whole life for 2 things, the chance to fly and the chance to show her rocket scientist mother that she's worth coming home for. NTHE's first family dinner in 3 years took place at a pizza restaurant in downtown Berkeley, chosen specifically because it was wheelchair-accessible and neutral territory where no one would feel the weight of too much history. Maya had spent 2 hours getting ready, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a blue dress that Emmanuel said matched her eyes, and practicing conversation topics that might interest a mother who built spaceships for a living. Victoria arrived 15 minutes early, sitting in her rental car in the parking lot while fighting waves of panic that felt more intense than pre-launch anxiety. She'd faced congressional budget committees and International Space Agency reviews with less nervousness than she felt about having dinner with her own daughter. The last 3 years had been so carefully constructed around avoiding this exact moment that she'd forgotten how to be Maya's mother rather than Dr. Sophia Chen, NASA executive. And when Emmanuel wheeled Maya through the restaurant entrance, Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The 5-year-old she'd left behind had become a poised 8-year-old with intelligent dark eyes and Emmanuel's determined chin. Maya moved through the restaurant with practiced efficiency, navigating between tables and greeting the hostess with the kind of social skills that spoke of a child who'd learned to make adults comfortable with her presence. "And you're taller than I expected," Maya said when Victoria stood to greet them, her tone carrying the careful politeness she'd learned to use with important strangers. "Daddy said you work with rockets, but he didn't mention that rocket scientists were tall." Victoria knelt beside Maya's wheelchair, bringing herself to eye level in a gesture that Emmanuel noted with surprise. During their marriage, Victoria had often remained standing during conversations with Maya, distracted by work calls or mentally reviewing technical problems. This deliberate effort to connect at Maya's physical level suggested that perhaps some things had changed during their separation. "I missed watching you grow up," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying an honesty that surprised all 3 of them. "You're much more beautiful and articulate than I remembered, and I'm sorry I wasn't here to see you become this amazing person." Maya studied her mother's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Daddy said you left because you were sad about my accident and needed to focus on important work. But he also said you might come back someday when you figured out how to be happy again." The directness of Maya's observation cut through Victoria's carefully prepared explanations. She'd expected anger or resentment, had braced herself for accusations or emotional manipulation. Instead, Maya was offering her the same straightforward honesty that characterized all her interactions. No hidden agendas or adult games, just a child trying to understand the complicated behavior of the grown-ups in her life. "Your daddy was right about both things," Victoria admitted. "I was sad, and I was afraid that my sadness would make things harder for you and him. But I was wrong to think that leaving would help anyone. I should have stayed and figured out how to be sad and still be your mother." Maya nodded thoughtfully, as if this explanation made more sense than the sanitized versions she'd been given before. "Are you still sad?" "Sometimes," Victoria said. "But seeing you now and learning about Daddy's flying wheelchair project makes me feel hopeful in a way I haven't felt for a long time." Emmanuel watched this exchange with cautious optimism. The Victoria he'd married had been brilliant but emotionally distant, more comfortable with technical challenges than personal relationships. The woman sitting beside Maya's wheelchair seemed more present, more willing to engage with messy human emotions rather than retreating into work abstractions. And as they ordered dinner and settled into conversation, Victoria found herself genuinely curious about Maya's daily life rather than feeling obligated to show parental interest. She asked about school subjects, favorite books, and friendship dynamics with the same focused attention she brought to technical briefings. Maya responded by sharing stories about adaptive technology challenges, playground accessibility issues, and her detailed plans for what she would do when the flying wheelchair was ready for human testing. "I want to fly to the top of the Campanile," Maya explained, referring to UC Berkeley's iconic clock tower. "Daddy says it's 307 feet tall, and I've calculated that the flying wheelchair should be able to reach that altitude based on the power-to-weight ratios Dr. Richardson showed me. Plus, the view would be amazing." Victoria felt a flutter of maternal terror at the thought of Maya flying hundreds of feet above the ground, but she also recognized her daughter's methodical approach to risk assessment. Maya wasn't fantasizing about reckless adventures. She was making informed plans based on technical specifications and safety considerations. "Have you thought about flight planning and air traffic considerations?" Victoria asked. treating Maya's aviation dreams with the same seriousness she would give to mission planning. The airspace around the campanile might require clearance from Oakland Airport approach control. Maya's eyes lit up with excitement that someone was taking her flying ambitions seriously rather than dismissing them as childhood fantasy. I hadn't considered air traffic control. Do you think they have regulations for flying wheelchairs? What altitude would be safe for avoiding commercial aircraft? Emmanuel watched Victoria engage with Maya's questions, explaining aviation regulations and airspace management with patient detail. This was the Victoria he'd fallen in love with. Brilliant, passionate about technical subjects, but now applying that intensity to their daughter's interests rather than using it as an escape from family responsibilities. NTHE conversation naturally shifted to Victoria's work at NASA, and Maya peppered her with questions about rocket propulsion, orbital mechanics, and space station operations. Victoria found herself simplifying complex engineering concepts in ways that made them accessible to an 8-year-old, discovering that explaining space technology to Maya was both challenging and deeply satisfying. The ion drives I work on are actually similar to Daddy's flying wheelchair in some ways, Victoria explained, sketching diagrams on napkins. Both systems use electric propulsion, but ion drives work in the vacuum of space while the wheelchair has to generate lift in Earth's atmosphere. The physics are related, but the engineering challenges are completely different. Maya studied the sketches with intense concentration. Could you combine the technologies? Like, could a flying wheelchair use ion propulsion for space travel? NTHE question was so unexpected and technically sophisticated that Victoria paused, considering the possibilities. A hybrid propulsion system that could function both in atmosphere and in space was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that NASA valued, but it had come from an 8-year-old who was simply trying to understand how her father's invention related to her mother's work. That's actually a brilliant question, Victoria said slowly. I don't think anyone has considered hybrid atmospheric space mobility systems for individual users. The power requirements would be enormous, but the concept isn't impossible. Emmanuel had been quietly observing this technical discussion between his daughter and ex-wife, noting how Maya's curiosity seemed to bridge the gap between Victoria's professional expertise and personal relationships. For the first time since their divorce, Victoria wasn't treating her family as a distraction from important work. Instead, she was discovering that Maya's questions were as intellectually stimulating as anything she encountered in her NASA laboratory. As dinner progressed, the conversation became more natural and less careful. Maya shared stories about school friends, described her physical therapy exercises, and explained her detailed plans for the flying wheelchair test flights. Victoria talked about recent space missions, described the challenges of Mars mission planning, and admitted that her work had become lonely in ways she was only beginning to recognize. I'd been thinking, Victoria said as they prepared to leave the restaurant, that maybe I could spend more time in California while the flying wheelchair project moves toward human testing. NASA has been encouraging collaboration with university research programs, and this technology could have applications for space-based mobility systems. And Maya looked hopeful, but cautious, clearly wanting to believe that her mother might become a regular presence in her life, but having learned not to expect too much from adult promises. Would you stay long enough to see me fly? I'd like to stay long enough to help make sure you can fly safely, Victoria replied. Your daddy has built something amazing, but bringing it to human testing will require expertise in aerospace safety systems. I think I can help with that. Emmanuel felt a complex mixture of hope and wariness. Victoria's technical expertise could indeed accelerate the project timeline and improve safety systems, but he was concerned about Maya's emotional vulnerability if Victoria disappeared again when the work was complete. Maya, Emmanuel said carefully, your mother has important responsibilities in Florida. We need to be prepared for the possibility that she might not be able to stay as long as we'd like. Victoria looked at Emmanuel, understanding the protective instinct behind his words, but also recognizing the challenge they represented. If she wanted to rebuild her relationship with Maya, she would need to prove her commitment through consistent presence rather than grand gestures or professional contributions. My responsibilities in Florida are important, Victoria said, addressing both Emmanuel and Maya. But they're not more important than figuring out how to be your mother again. I've spent 3 years learning how to live without you, and it turns out I'm not very good at it. Maya reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. a gesture so simple and trusting that Victoria felt tears threatening to spill over. "I'm not very good at living without you either," Maya said quietly. "Maybe we can figure out how to be better at being a family again." As they left the restaurant together, Emmanuel pushing Maya's wheelchair while Victoria walked beside them. All three members of the family understood that this dinner had been more than a reunion. It had been the beginning of a renegotiation of their relationships, with Maya's flying dreams serving as the bridge that might allow them to find their way back to each other. NTHEUC Berkeley Laboratory had been transformed into something resembling a high-tech medical facility crossed with an aircraft hangar. Over the past 6 weeks, Victoria had used her NASA connections to bring in specialized equipment that most university research programs could never afford: motion capture systems that tracked movement with millimeter precision, physiological monitoring equipment that measured stress responses and cognitive load, and safety systems that could intervene automatically if any parameter moved outside acceptable ranges. Maya had become the project's most dedicated test subject, spending 3 afternoons a week in the lab working with the development team to refine the flying wheelchair's control systems. But instead of feeling like a patient undergoing medical testing, Maya felt like an astronaut preparing for a space mission. Victoria had insisted on treating her with the same professional respect that NASA showed to its pilots, complete with detailed briefings, systematic training protocols, and careful documentation of every test session. "Today we're going to work on altitude hold at 6 feet," Dr. Richardson announced during Maya's Tuesday afternoon session. "The new control algorithms that your mother developed should make it easier to maintain stable hover without constant input corrections." Maya settled into the flying wheelchair with practiced ease, her small hands finding the control interfaces that had been custom-fitted to her reach and grip strength. The seat and restraint system had been rebuilt 3 times, based on her feedback, evolving from a modified standard wheelchair to something that looked more like a pilot's seat from a science fiction movie. Every component had been designed with Maya's specific needs in mind, creating a human-machine interface that felt natural rather than adaptive. Victoria watched from the control station, monitoring telemetry data that tracked everything from motor temperatures to Maya's heart rate. The physiological monitoring had been her addition to the project, a recognition that flying was as much a psychological challenge as a technical one, especially for a child who had spent most of her life earthbound. And lifting off in 3, 2, 1. Maya announced, her voice steady despite the excitement that Victoria could detect in her biometric readings. The wheelchair rose smoothly from the laboratory floor, 8 rotors spinning with barely audible precision. Maya had named the rotors after planets. Mercury is running a little hot today, but Jupiter and Saturn are perfectly balanced, turning the technical components into friendly companions rather than intimidating machinery. Emmanuel operated the safety override system from a secondary control station, ready to take command of the wheelchair if anything went wrong. But after 6 weeks of testing, Maya had developed piloting skills that impressed even the graduate students who had been studying aircraft control theory for years. Her spatial awareness was remarkable, and her ability to make smooth control inputs suggested an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics that couldn't be taught through textbooks. "Altitude stable at 6 feet," Maya reported, holding the wheelchair in a perfect hover while rotating slowly to demonstrate her control precision. "All planets are happy, and I can see Dr. Richardson's messy desk from up here, NDR." Richardson laughed, but Victoria noted the professional competence in Maya's flight reporting. Her daughter had internalized proper aviation communication protocols without being formally taught, developing habits that would serve her well if she ever pursued actual pilot certification. "Try moving forward 10 feet, then returning to your starting position," Victoria instructed through the communication system. "Focus on smooth acceleration and deceleration rather than speed." Maya's flight path was textbook perfect: gradual acceleration, steady forward movement, and a gentle return to hover that demonstrated exceptional control sensitivity. Victoria found herself thinking that Maya's flying skills were already superior to some of the test pilots she'd worked with during her NASA career. NBUT, the most remarkable aspect of Maya's development wasn't technical, it was psychological. The confident, articulate child who commanded the flying wheelchair bore little resemblance to the cautious, apologetic girl who had learned to minimize her needs and expectations. Flight had given Maya a sense of personal agency that Emmanuel and Victoria could see transforming her entire approach to challenges and opportunities. "I want to try something," Maya announced after completing her assigned maneuvers. Can I fly over to the window and look outside? I've been calculating the flight path, and I think I can navigate around the lab equipment safely. Victoria checked the safety parameters, noting that Maya's proposed route would take her higher and farther from the takeoff point than any previous test flight. The request represented a significant expansion of the operational envelope, but Maya's demonstrated competence suggested she was ready for increased complexity. Approved, Victoria said after consulting with Emmanuel and Dr. Richardson. But maintain constant communication and return immediately if you feel any control irregularities. Maya's flight to the laboratory window was flawless, demonstrating the kind of confident navigation that spoke of genuine pilot instincts rather than programmed responses. She hovered outside the third-floor window, looking down at the campus courtyard where students were walking between classes, and her excited commentary revealed a perspective that few people ever experienced. "I can see everything from up here," Maya said, her voice filled with wonder. "The pathways look like a maze, and the people look like they're moving in patterns. It's beautiful and mathematical at the same time." Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to Maya describe the view from above. Her daughter wasn't just flying. She was experiencing the kind of spatial perspective and freedom that had drawn Victoria to aerospace engineering in the first place. Maya was discovering that the world looked different from above, that problems seemed smaller and possibilities seemed larger when viewed from a higher vantage point. NTHE weekly progress meetings had become collaborative sessions that brought together expertise from multiple disciplines. Emmanuel contributed mechanical engineering insights and practical problem-solving approaches. Victoria provided aerospace systems knowledge and regulatory guidance. Dr. Richardson offered academic research perspectives and access to university resources. But Maya had become the project's most valuable consultant, offering user feedback that guided every design decision. "The control sensitivity feels perfect now," Maya reported during that week's debrief session. "But I've been thinking about emergency procedures. What happens if one of the planets stops working while I'm flying?" NTHE question demonstrated the kind of safety consciousness that impressed all the adults involved in the project. Maya wasn't just learning to fly. She was learning to think like a pilot, considering failure modes and developing contingency plans for situations she hoped never to encounter. "We've programmed automatic compensation for single motor failures," Dr. Richardson explained, "but you're right to think about emergency procedures. Your mother has been developing training protocols for various failure scenarios." Victoria had indeed been working on emergency procedures, drawing from her experience with spacecraft systems that needed to function reliably in environments where failure could be catastrophic. The flying wheelchair incorporated redundancy and safety systems that exceeded most general aviation aircraft, but Victoria understood that no technology was foolproof when human lives were at stake. "Next week, we're going to practice controlled landings with simulated motor failures," Victoria explained to Maya. "You'll learn how to maintain control and find safe landing spots, even if the wheelchair isn't performing perfectly." Naya nodded seriously, understanding that emergency training was a necessary part of preparing for more advanced flight operations. "Will I eventually be able to fly outside the laboratory? I've been dreaming about flying over the campus, and maybe even to the campanile." NTHE question everyone had been anticipating finally hung in the air. Maya's skills had progressed to the point where laboratory flights were becoming routine rather than challenging. The next logical step was expanding operations to outdoor environments, but that transition would require regulatory approvals and safety certifications that could take months to obtain. "That's exactly what we're working toward," Emmanuel said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent the past year turning impossible dreams into engineering reality. "Your mother thinks she can get expedited approval for outdoor testing through NASA's experimental aircraft program. And Victoria had been working with federal aviation authorities to establish a regulatory framework for personal flying devices, arguing that the technology represented an important step towards space-based mobility systems. The bureaucratic process was complex, but Victoria's reputation and institutional connections were opening doors that would have remained closed to civilian inventors. "How long before I can fly to school?" Maya asked with the kind of practical curiosity that made the adults smile. She wasn't fantasizing about impossible adventures. She was planning for a future where flight was simply another mode of transportation. "Let's master outdoor flight operations first," Victoria said diplomatically. "But I don't see any technical reason why you couldn't eventually commute by air, assuming we can navigate the regulatory requirements." As the testing session concluded and Maya transferred back to her standard wheelchair, Victoria reflected on how much had changed since she'd first walked into the Berkeley laboratory. She'd come expecting to review interesting technology and had instead rediscovered her daughter and begun rebuilding her family. The flying wheelchair project had given her a way to contribute to Maya's life that felt meaningful rather than obligatory, and Maya's progress as a pilot had reminded Victoria why aerospace engineering could be personally fulfilling rather than just professionally successful. Emmanuel had been watching Victoria's transformation with cautious optimism. The woman who had fled from family responsibilities 3 years earlier had become Maya's most dedicated advocate and technical mentor, but he wondered whether Victoria's renewed engagement would survive the transition from exciting research project to routine family life. NTHAT question would be answered in the coming weeks, as Maya prepared for her first outdoor flight and the family prepared to discover whether their rebuilt relationships could withstand the challenges of moving from laboratory testing to real-world operations. NTHE news story broke on a quiet Wednesday morning in early November when technology journalist Sarah Martinez published an article in TechCrunch titled "Father Builds Flying." Within 6 hours, the story had been picked up by CNN, BBC, and every major news outlet in North America. By evening, the UC Berkeley laboratory was surrounded by news vans, and Emmanuel's phone was ringing every 30 seconds with interview requests from around the world. NTHE media attention had been triggered by a seemingly innocent social media post. Dr. Richardson had shared a 30-second video of Maya performing a routine test flight, thinking it would interest her small circle of academic colleagues. But the video of an 8-year-old girl gracefully piloting a flying wheelchair through precise maneuvers had captured the internet's imagination in ways none of them had anticipated. "Dad, there are helicopters outside," Maya announced from her bedroom window, where she'd been watching news crews set up satellite trucks in the university parking lot. Real helicopters, not just the flying wheelchair. "Are they here because of me?" Emmanuel looked out at the media circus that had transformed the normally quiet campus into something resembling a breaking news event. The attention was both thrilling and terrifying. Validation that their project mattered, but also unwanted scrutiny of a family that was still rebuilding its relationships. Victoria had arrived from her temporary apartment to find reporters attempting to interview random students about the flying wheelchair girl. The questions they were asking revealed how little the media understood about the technology or the family dynamics involved in the project. "Mr. Ford, is it true that your ex-wife abandoned your disabled daughter to pursue her NASA career?" one reporter had shouted as Victoria approached the laboratory building. "Drive." "Chen, are you exploiting your daughter's disability to advance your own research interests?" another had called out, demonstrating the kind of cynical interpretation that reduced complex human stories to tabloid headlines. Victoria had pushed through the crowd without comment, but Emmanuel could see that the media characterizations were affecting her more deeply than she wanted to admit. The reporters were framing their story as either heartwarming inspiration or scandalous family drama, missing the genuine innovation and careful engineering that had made Maya's flights possible. Inside the laboratory, the team gathered for an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the sudden public attention. Maya sat in her standard wheelchair, still wearing the flight suit she'd used for that morning's test session, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had during any of her actual flights. "I don't understand why everyone is so excited," Maya said quietly. "Flying wheelchairs aren't that different from regular wheelchairs, except they go up instead of just forward and backward. Why are people acting like it's magic?" Dr. Richardson pulled up the social media metrics on her laptop, showing the viral spread of the video across multiple platforms. "Your flight video has been viewed 2.3 million times in the past 12 hours, she explained. "People are sharing it because they've never seen anything like it before. To most of the world, what you're doing really does look like magic." Emmanuel studied the comments streaming beneath the video, noting the mixture of amazement, skepticism, and emotional responses that Maya's flight had generated. Many viewers were sharing their own stories about disability and mobility challenges, while others were debating the safety and practicality of personal flight technology. "Some of these comments are really beautiful," Victoria observed, reading messages from parents of disabled children who saw Maya's flight as proof that their own kids could dream bigger. "But some of them are—" She trailed off, not wanting to share the crueler comments that questioned whether the technology was safe or whether the family was exploiting Maya for attention. NTHE media attention had attracted more than just journalists. Representatives from medical device companies had begun calling, offering to buy the technology or license the patents. Military contractors were interested in applications for battlefield mobility. Toy companies wanted to discuss consumer versions for children's entertainment. Everyone wants to turn this into something it wasn't meant to be, Emmanuel said, feeling overwhelmed by the commercial interest in what had started as a personal project to help his daughter. Maya's flying wheelchair isn't a product or a weapon or a toy. It's assistive technology designed to give one little girl the freedom she deserves. The attention had also brought unexpected support from the disability rights community. Organizations that advocated for accessibility and inclusion had begun sharing Maya's story as an example of innovation that prioritized user needs over commercial considerations. Other families with disabled children were reaching out to share their own stories and ask whether similar technology might be available for their kids. "Anne, look at this email," Victoria said, reading from her laptop. "It's from the parents of a 12-year-old boy with muscular dystrophy in Germany. They want to know if we could help them build a flying wheelchair adapted for his specific needs." Maya listened to the growing list of requests and inquiries with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was processing implications that the adults might not have considered. "Maybe this is bigger than just me," she said finally. "I mean, I love flying, and I'm grateful that Daddy built this for me. But if other kids could have flying wheelchairs too, wouldn't that be better than just me being special?" NTHE comment revealed a generosity of spirit that reminded Emmanuel why he'd been willing to sacrifice so much time and money for this project. Maya understood that her privilege in having a father with engineering skills and a mother with aerospace connections wasn't shared by most families dealing with mobility challenges. NDR. Richardson had been fielding calls from university administrators who were suddenly very interested in the project that had been operating quietly in their engineering department. The university's technology transfer office wanted to discuss intellectual property arrangements, while the public relations department was eager to capitalize on the positive media attention. "The university is offering significant funding to expand the research program," Dr. Richardson reported. "They want to establish a center for adaptive mobility technology with Maya's flying wheelchair as the flagship project." NTHE offer was tempting, but Emmanuel was wary of institutional involvement that might transform their personal project into an academic bureaucracy. He'd seen too many promising technologies get lost in university research programs that prioritized publication over practical application. Victoria had been dealing with interest from NASA headquarters, where administrators were suddenly very curious about her unauthorized collaboration with civilian inventors. Her supervisor had called that morning to discuss whether the flying wheelchair project aligned with NASA's mission, and whether Victoria's involvement represented appropriate use of federal resources. "I may need to take a leave of absence from NASA to continue working on this project," Victoria admitted to Emmanuel during a brief moment when they were alone in the laboratory. "The agency isn't comfortable with the media attention, and they're concerned about liability if something goes wrong during testing." The possibility of Victoria leaving her NASA career to focus on the flying wheelchair project was both encouraging and concerning for Emmanuel. It demonstrated her commitment to rebuilding their family, but it also represented a significant professional sacrifice that could create resentment if the project didn't succeed. "You don't have to choose between your career and Maya," Emmanuel said carefully. "We can figure out ways to continue the project without putting your job at risk." "Maybe I do have to choose," Victoria replied, watching Maya practice control inputs on a non-powered trainer wheelchair. "For 3 years, I've been telling myself that my NASA work was too important to interrupt for family considerations. But watching Maya learn to fly has reminded me that some things are more important than advancing my career." NTHE conversation was interrupted by Maya's excited announcement that she'd received a video message from Chris Hadfield, the famous Canadian astronaut, congratulating her on her flying achievement and encouraging her to continue pursuing aviation and space exploration. "He says that pilots and astronauts are just people who refuse to accept that humans belong on the ground," Maya reported, replaying the message for the 3rd time. "And he wants to know if I've thought about applying to space camp when I'm older." NTHE astronaut's endorsement represented exactly the kind of validation that could help legitimize the flying wheelchair project in the eyes of aerospace professionals and federal regulators. But more importantly for Maya, it confirmed that her dreams of flight were taken seriously by people who had turned similar dreams into actual careers. And as the day progressed and the media attention continued to intensify, the family found themselves facing a decision that would determine the future direction of the project. They could try to maintain privacy and continue development quietly, accepting limited impact in exchange for personal control. Or they could embrace the public attention and use it to advocate for broader accessibility in aviation and mobility technology. And Maya made the decision for them with characteristic directness. "I want to talk to the reporters," she announced during that evening's family meeting. "Not because I like being on TV, but because maybe other kids will see that flying isn't just for people who can walk. Maybe some of those kids will become engineers and build even better flying wheelchairs." NHER willingness to accept public scrutiny in service of a larger cause reminded Emmanuel and Victoria why they'd fallen in love with each other years earlier, and why Maya represented the best of both their personalities. Their daughter was ready to become an advocate for possibility rather than just a beneficiary of innovation. NTHE media interviews would begin the next morning, transforming Maya from a private individual into a public symbol of what was possible when families refused to accept limitations as permanent conditions. NTHE envelope from the Federal Aviation Administration arrived on a gray December morning, carrying the kind of official weight that could either validate months of careful preparation or destroy everything they'd worked toward. Emmanuel signed for the certified letter with hands that trembled slightly, knowing that the contents would determine whether Maya's flying wheelchair could ever operate legally outside the controlled environment of the university laboratory. Victoria had been waiting by the phone for 3 weeks, ever since her final meeting with FAA administrators in Washington, D.C. The regulatory approval process for experimental aircraft was complex under normal circumstances, but creating a new category for powered mobility device had required negotiations that pushed the boundaries of existing aviation law. The FAA had never been asked to certify a flying wheelchair, and their initial response had been bureaucratic skepticism rather than enthusiasm for innovation. "What does it say?" Maya asked from her position at the kitchen table, where she'd been working on a physics project that involved calculating optimal flight paths between campus buildings. Even at 8 years old, Maya had internalized the understanding that government paperwork could make or break dreams, and she'd learned to read her parents' faces for signs of good or bad news. Emmanuel opened the envelope with careful precision, unfolding multiple pages of legal language and technical specifications. The cover letter was signed by Deputy Administrator Patricia Morrison, whom Victoria had worked with during previous NASA collaborations, and the tone was more encouraging than Emmanuel had dared to hope. "Experimental Airworthiness Certificate granted." Emmanuel read aloud, his voice catching slightly on the words. "Valid for outdoor flight operations within designated airspace, subject to specific operational limitations and safety requirements." Maya's reaction was immediate and joyful. A whoop of excitement that brought neighbors to their windows, followed by rapid-fire questions about what the approval meant for her flying future. But as Emmanuel continued reading the detailed restrictions, his initial elation gave way to more complex emotions. NTHE FAA had approved outdoor flights, but only within a strictly controlled flight envelope. Maya could fly no higher than 100 feet above ground level, no faster than 15 miles per hour, and only within designated areas that had been surveyed for obstacles and emergency landing zones. All flights required advance notification to air traffic control, real-time communication with ground observers, and immediate landing capability if weather conditions deteriorated. "It's more restrictive than I hoped," Victoria admitted, reviewing the technical specifications that would govern Maya's outdoor operations. "But it's also more permissive than anyone expected for the first certification of this technology. We're making aviation history here." NDR. Richardson had arranged for the first outdoor flight test to take place at the university's research airfield, a small facility normally used for experimental aircraft and drone operations. The airfield was perfect for Maya's needs: controlled airspace, emergency equipment, and minimal interference from commercial aviation operations. Maya had been preparing for outdoor flight operations with the same methodical approach she'd applied to laboratory testing. She'd studied weather patterns, memorized emergency procedures, and practiced navigation using visual landmarks rather than the laboratory's controlled environment. Her flying skills had progressed to the point where she could perform complex maneuvers with professional precision, but outdoor flight would introduce variables that no amount of laboratory practice could simulate. NTHE, night before the first outdoor test flight, Maya lay awake in her bed, alternating between excitement and nervousness about the challenges ahead. Flying outside meant dealing with wind currents, changing light conditions, and the psychological challenge of operating over real terrain rather than laboratory floors. She'd dreamed about outdoor flight for months, But the reality of tomorrow's test felt both thrilling and intimidating. Emmanuel had spent the evening performing final equipment checks and reviewing emergency procedures with Maya, ensuring that she understood the additional risks and responsibilities that came with outdoor operations. The flying wheelchair had been modified with enhanced navigation systems, improved communication equipment, and backup safety systems that exceeded FAA requirements for experimental aircraft. "Are you ready for this?" Emmanuel asked Maya as he tucked her into bed, noting the mixture of determination and nervousness in her expression. "I've been ready my whole life," Maya replied, echoing the words she'd used when they first started working on the flying wheelchair. "But tomorrow feels different because it's real flying, not just practice flying." Nogiman-ready Victoria had taken a temporary leave of absence from NASA to be present for Maya's first outdoor flight, understanding that this moment represented more than just a technological milestone. For their family, Maya's outdoor flight would symbolize the completion of a journey that had begun with a father's desperate love and a daughter's impossible dream. The morning of the test flight dawned clear and calm. With light winds and unlimited visibility, perfect conditions for Maya's transition to outdoor operations. The research airfield was bustling with activity as the team prepared for the historic flight, with representatives from the FAA, university administration, and media organizations documenting every aspect of the preparation. Naya arrived at the airfield wearing a custom flight suit that Victoria had designed, complete with communication equipment and physiological monitoring systems. She looked like a miniature astronaut preparing for a space mission, and her confident demeanor suggested that she was ready to handle whatever challenges outdoor flight might present. "Today's flight plan is conservative," Dr. Richardson explained to the assembled observers. "Maya will perform a series of basic maneuvers within a designated flight area, focusing on adapting her skills to outdoor conditions rather than pushing operational limits." The flying wheelchair had been transported to the airfield in a custom trailer that Emmanuel had built, allowing the equipment to arrive in perfect condition without the stress of road transport. As the team performed final pre-flight inspections, Maya reviewed her checklist with the professional attention to detail that had impressed every adult involved in the project. And all systems showing green, Maya reported settling into the wheelchair and performing her pre-flight control checks. Weather conditions optimal, communication clear, emergency procedures reviewed and understood. The formal language masked Maya's excitement, but Victoria could see the anticipation in her daughter's face as she prepared for the moment she'd been dreaming about since the project began. This wasn't just a test flight. It was Maya's graduation from earthbound child to actual pilot. From dreamer to aviator, Emmanuel took his position at the ground control station, monitoring telemetry data and maintaining radio communication with Maya throughout the flight. Victoria operated the backup safety systems, ready to intervene if any parameter moved outside acceptable ranges. Dr. Richardson coordinated with FAA observers, ensuring that every aspect of the flight met regulatory requirements. Millfield Tower. This is Maya Ford in experimental aircraft, November 77 Whiskey Maya, requesting clearance for test flight operations. Maya announced over the radio, using the call sign that had been assigned specifically for her flying wheelchair. "November 77 Whiskey Maya, Millfield Tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Winds calm. Good luck, Maya." The radio exchange was routine by aviation standards, but for Maya it represented acceptance into the community of pilots who had earned the right to operate aircraft in controlled airspace. She was no longer just a child with a dream. She was a certified pilot preparing for her first solo flight in unrestricted airspace. Beginning takeoff sequence, Maya announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Rotor systems active. Liftoff in 3, 2, 1. The flying wheelchair rose from the airfield surface with smooth precision, carrying Maya into the open sky for the first time in her life. The laboratory flights had been preparation. This was the real thing. Actual flight over real terrain, with real wind and real consequences for any mistakes. Maya climbed to her approved altitude of 50 feet and began demonstrating basic flight maneuvers. Everyone watching understood that they were witnessing the birth of a new era in human mobility. The impossible had become routine, and an 8-year-old girl was proving that the sky truly belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. The most remarkable aspect of Maya's flight wasn't the technology or the regulatory breakthrough. It was the pure joy on her face as she experienced the freedom that she'd been waiting 8 years to discover. NTHE phone call from Houston came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in early February, jolting Victoria awake with the kind of Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, NASA's Director of Human Spaceflight, was calling with news that would transform Maya's flying wheelchair project from experimental technology into a critical component of America's return to space. "And Victoria, I need you back in Houston immediately," Dr. Rodriguez said without preamble. "The Artemis IV mission has encountered a significant challenge with EVA mobility systems, and your flying wheelchair technology might be exactly what we need to solve it." And Victoria sat up in bed, her mind immediately shifting into the crisis management mode that had served her throughout her NASA career. The Artemis program represented humanity's return to the moon after a 50-year absence, and any problems with extravehicular activity systems could delay missions that had been planned for years. "And what kind of mobility challenge?" Victoria asked, already reaching for her laptop to review the latest Artemis mission parameters. "The Lunar Surface Operations team has been struggling with astronaut mobility in low-gravity environments," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "Traditional spacesuits are too bulky for the kind of precise maneuvering we need for construction and exploration activities. We need something that provides powered mobility while maintaining the flexibility for detailed work." Victoria felt her pulse quicken as she realized the implications. Maya's flying wheelchair had been designed to provide precise control and intuitive maneuvering in three-dimensional space, exactly the capabilities that might be needed for lunar surface operations. The control algorithms that allowed Maya to navigate through laboratory obstacles could potentially be adapted for astronauts working in the moon's low-gravity environment. "How soon do you need me in Houston?" Victoria asked, already mentally calculating the logistics of leaving California while Maya's outdoor flight testing was still in its critical early phases today, if possible. "We're facing a review board next week that could determine whether Artemis IV launches on schedule or gets delayed indefinitely. Your flying wheelchair technology might be our best option for solving the mobility issues." NTHE conversation that followed with Emmanuel and Maya was one of the most difficult Victoria had faced since returning to their lives. She'd spent the past 4 months rebuilding her relationship with Maya and proving her commitment to their family. Now NASA was asking her to choose between her professional responsibilities and her personal commitments at exactly the moment when Maya needed her support most. "They want me to adapt the flying wheelchair technology for lunar operations," Victoria explained to Emmanuel and Maya over breakfast, noting how Maya's excitement about the space connection was tempered by obvious concern about another separation. "That's amazing," Maya said, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm despite her worry. "My flying wheelchair could help astronauts explore the moon? That's like the coolest thing ever." Emmanuel watched Victoria's face carefully, recognizing the internal conflict she was experiencing. The NASA opportunity represented validation for the technology they developed and potential funding that could accelerate development of flying wheelchairs for other disabled children. But it also threatened to repeat the pattern that had torn their family apart 3 years earlier. "How long would you need to be in Houston?" Emmanuel asked, his tone neutral but his concern evident. "Probably 6 to 8 weeks for the initial development work," Victoria admitted. "But if the technology is selected for the Artemis program, I might need to relocate permanently to oversee the integration process." Maya absorbed this information with the emotional maturity she developed through years of adapting to adult decisions that affected her life. "Will you be able to watch my advanced flight tests if you're in Houston?" NTHE question cut to the heart of Victoria's dilemma. Maya was scheduled to begin extended-range flight operations within the next month, including her long-anticipated flight to the UC Berkeley Campanile. These milestones represented the culmination of everything they'd worked toward, and Victoria's absence would mean missing the moments she'd spent months preparing for. "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "The NASA project timeline is aggressive, and spaceflight development doesn't pause for personal considerations." Maya was quiet for several minutes, her 8-year-old mind working through implications that would challenge adults. Finally, she looked up at her parents with an expression that suggested she'd reached a significant decision. "I think you should go to Houston," Maya said firmly. "Not because I want you to leave, but because helping astronauts explore space is too important to ignore. And besides, if my flying wheelchair helps people walk on the moon, that's like the ultimate flying." Emmanuel felt his heart break a little at Maya's generosity, even as he admired her ability to see beyond her own immediate needs. Maya, you don't have to sacrifice your mother's presence for NASA's benefit. There might be ways to handle both responsibilities. NBUT Victoria was already formulating a plan that might allow her to fulfill her professional obligations without abandoning her family commitments. What if we brought the entire project to Houston? She suggested. NASA has advanced facilities for testing mobility systems, and the Space Center has medical equipment that could help us accelerate Maya's flight training. NTHE proposal was audacious, but potentially brilliant. Instead of choosing between family and career, Victoria was suggesting a merger that could benefit both the Flying Wheelchair Project and NASA's Lunar Exploration Program. Maya could continue her flight development while contributing to actual space mission planning, and the family could stay together while advancing both their personal and professional goals. NDR. Richardson received the proposal with excitement that bordered on disbelief. You're suggesting that we relocate our entire research program to Johnson Space Center? That would be like winning the academic lottery. Emmanuel was more cautious, remembering how institutional involvement could transform personal projects into bureaucratic nightmares. What happens to our control over the technology development? Would NASA expect to own the flying wheelchair patents? Victoria had anticipated this concern and had already begun negotiating intellectual property arrangements that would protect Emmanuel's innovations while allowing NASA to benefit from the technology. I'm proposing a collaboration where Emmanuel retains rights to the civilian applications while NASA gets access to the space-related adaptations. NTHE logistics of relocating the project to Houston were complex but manageable. NASA could provide laboratory space, technical support, and access to testing facilities that exceeded anything available at UC Berkeley. Maya could continue her flight training while also participating in astronaut mobility research, potentially becoming the youngest person ever to contribute to space mission development. And Maya's response to the Houston proposal was characteristically direct. Would I get to meet real astronauts? And could I test my flying wheelchair in NASA's training facilities? You'd be working with astronauts who are preparing for moon missions, Victoria confirmed. And NASA has simulation facilities that could let you practice flying in low-gravity conditions. NTHE possibility of training in lunar gravity simulation was so exciting that Maya could barely contain her enthusiasm. She'd been dreaming about space exploration since learning about her mother's work, and the opportunity to contribute to actual space missions represented a level of involvement she'd never imagined possible. Emmanuel found himself caught between admiration for Maya's courage and concern about exposing her to the intense pressures of NASA's mission-critical environment. Are you sure you're ready for that level of responsibility? Working with NASA means that people's lives might depend on the technology you help develop. Maya considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. People's lives already depend on flying wheelchairs working correctly, she pointed out. If I make a mistake during my test flights, I could get hurt. If astronauts use technology based on my flying wheelchair and I helped make it better, then maybe I helped keep them safe too. NTHE conversation continued for hours as the family worked through the practical and emotional implications of the Houston opportunity. By evening, they'd reached a consensus that surprised all of them. They would move to Houston as a family, with Emmanuel taking a leave of absence from his auto shop job and Maya transferring to a school near Johnson Space Center. NTHE decision represented more than just a change of location. It was a commitment to pursuing opportunities that honored both Maya's needs and Victoria's career, proving that families could support each other's dreams without requiring anyone to sacrifice their potential. Maya asked the question that it's making sure that everyone who wants to explore gets the chance to do it, whether they're going to the moon or just trying to get to school. NTHE wisdom in her observation reminded Emmanuel and Victoria that their daughter had learned lessons about inclusion and possibility that could benefit not just their family, but the entire space program that was preparing to return humanity to the stars. NTHE Johnson Space Center's Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory had been transformed into something unprecedented in NASA's 60-year history. Maya floated 30 feet underwater in a specialized diving suit, piloting a waterproofed version of her flying wheelchair through a mock-up of the lunar base that astronauts would construct during the Artemis V mission. The underwater environment simulated the low-gravity conditions of the moon, while allowing engineers to observe every aspect of Maya's maneuvering techniques in real time. Maya, Can you demonstrate the docking procedure with the habitat module? Dr. Patricia Williams called through the underwater communication system. The NASA flight director had been skeptical when Victoria first proposed using a 9-year-old's flying skills to develop astronaut mobility systems. But 3 weeks of testing had proven that Maya's intuitive understanding of three-dimensional movement was exactly what the space program needed. Maya guided her underwater flying wheelchair toward the cylindrical habitat module with the precision of a veteran astronaut, using micro-corrections and gentle approaches that minimized impact forces on the delicate equipment. Her technique was so smooth that watching engineers had begun incorporating her movement patterns into the training protocols for professional astronauts. Docking complete, Maya reported, her voice clear despite the underwater communication equipment. Contact gentle, all seals intact, ready for crew transfer operations. Above the pool, Emmanuel watched his daughter perform maneuvers that would be used by astronauts exploring the lunar surface in 18 months. The transformation of Maya's flying wheelchair from experimental disability technology to critical space exploration equipment had happened so quickly that he sometimes felt dizzy trying to process the implications. Victoria stood beside him at the observation deck, monitoring telemetry data from Maya's underwater tests, while simultaneously coordinating with mission planners who were redesigning lunar surface operations based on Maya's demonstrated capabilities. The flying wheelchair technology had solved mobility problems that NASA engineers had been struggling with for years. But more importantly, Maya's user feedback was revolutionizing how the space agency thought about human-machine interfaces. Her spatial awareness is remarkable, commented Commander Lisa Chang, the Artemis V mission commander who would be the first astronaut to use Maya's mobility technology on the lunar surface. Most trained pilots need weeks to develop the kind of precise control she's demonstrating instinctively. Commander Chang had initially been resistant to the idea of basing critical mission equipment on technology developed by a child, but working with Maya had changed her perspective entirely. Maya's insights into control sensitivity, emergency procedures, and user interface design were more practical and intuitive than anything produced by NASA's traditional engineering committees. NTHE underwater tests were the culmination of 6 months of intensive development work that had pushed both Maya and the flying wheelchair technology to new levels of sophistication. The space-rated version incorporated advanced life support systems, radiation shielding, and communication equipment that would allow astronauts to operate safely on the lunar surface for extended periods. NBUT, the most significant innovation had come from Maya herself. During early testing sessions, she'd suggested modifications to the control algorithms that would allow multiple flying wheelchairs to operate in formation, enabling coordinated exploration and construction activities that had never been possible with traditional spacesuits. And watch this formation flying demonstration, Maya announced through the underwater communication system. 2 additional flying wheelchairs operated by NASA test pilots joined Maya in the pool for a complex choreographed sequence that simulated construction of a lunar communications array. NTHE-3 underwater vehicles moved together with balletic precision, demonstrating the kind of coordinated operations that would be essential for building permanent lunar installations. Maya served as the formation leader, with the experienced test pilots following her navigation cues and movement patterns. Formation flying complete, Maya reported as the 3 vehicles returned to their starting positions. All objectives achieved, no collisions or interference detected. NTHE demonstration had been flawless, but more importantly, it had proven that Maya's flying wheelchair technology could enable entirely new approaches to space exploration. Instead of individual astronauts working in isolation, teams could now operate as coordinated units that accomplished complex tasks through collaborative movement. Emmanuel had been documenting every aspect of Maya's NASA testing, not just for engineering purposes, but to preserve the record of his daughter's extraordinary contribution to space exploration. At 9 years old, Maya had become the youngest person ever to influence NASA mission planning, and her innovations would affect human space exploration for decades to come. NTHE media attention surrounding Maya's NASA work had reached unprecedented levels. International news organizations were calling her the flying wheelchair pioneer, and space agencies from around the world were requesting demonstrations of the technology. But Maya had remained focused on the work itself rather than the celebrity that came with it. "And I don't want to be famous for being disabled," Maya had told a reporter from Space News magazine. I want to be known for helping people explore places they've never been before, whether that's the moon or just the playground at their school. The comment had perfectly captured Maya's perspective on her role in advancing both disability rights and space exploration. She understood that her flying wheelchair was important, not because it was a curiosity or an inspiration story, but because it solved real problems for real people who needed better mobility options. Victoria had been negotiating with international space agencies about licensing the flying wheelchair technology for their own lunar programs. The European Space Agency, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, and even private companies like SpaceX had expressed interest in incorporating Maya's innovations into their mission planning. This technology is going to change how humans explore space, Victoria explained to a gathering of international space officials. But more importantly, it's going to change how we think about accessibility and inclusion in extreme environments. NTHE business discussions were complex, but Emmanuel and Victoria had insisted on maintaining their original commitment to making the technology available for civilian disability applications. Any licensing agreements for space applications included provisions for supporting development of flying wheelchairs for children and adults with mobility limitations. And Maya's most ambitious test was scheduled for the following week. A live demonstration of lunar surface operations for the Congressional Committee that would determine funding for the Artemis program. The stakes couldn't be higher. Maya's performance would directly influence whether America returned to the moon on schedule or faced delays that could last years. "Are you nervous about the congressional demonstration?" Emmanuel asked Maya as they prepared to leave the NASA facility that evening. "A little," Maya admitted. "But mostly, I'm excited. If the Congresspeople understand how the flying wheelchair can help astronauts do their jobs better, then maybe they'll approve funding for more lunar missions. And maybe more kids like me will get to work on space projects too." Commander Chang had been working with Maya to prepare for the congressional demonstration, and her assessment was unequivocally positive. "Maya's technology doesn't just solve our mobility problems," she'd told the Mission Planning Committee. "It opens up possibilities for lunar exploration that we never considered before. She's not just helping this mission, she's defining what future missions will look like." As they drove home through Houston traffic, Emmanuel reflected on how far they'd traveled from that morning when he'd found Maya stuck at a curb cut in Millfield Valley. His daughter had progressed from struggling with basic transportation to literally designing the future of human space exploration. NBUT. The most remarkable aspect of Maya's journey wasn't the technology or the NASA recognition. It was her unwavering commitment to ensuring that her innovations would benefit other people facing similar challenges. She'd never forgotten that the flying wheelchair project had begun with a father's love and a daughter's dream, and she was determined that other families would have access to the same possibilities. NTHE congressional demonstration would be the ultimate test of whether Maya's vision of inclusive exploration could secure the support needed to transform dreams into reality. In 1 week, a 9-year-old girl would have the opportunity to convince the most powerful legislators in America that the future of space exploration belonged to everyone brave enough to reach for it. NTHE Hart Senate Office Building had never hosted a demonstration quite like the one taking place in its largest conference room on a crisp March morning. Maya Ford, now 9 years old, and wearing a custom NASA flight suit, sat in her space-rated flying wheelchair before a congressional subcommittee that would determine the fate of America's lunar exploration program. The room buzzed with nervous energy as senators, aerospace executives, and media representatives prepared to witness what many considered the most important technology demonstration in NASA's recent history. Senator Patricia Morrison, chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Space, Science, and Competitiveness, called the hearing to order with unusual gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to evaluate revolutionary mobility technology that could determine whether the United States maintains its leadership in space exploration. The Artemis program's success may depend on innovations developed by the youngest aerospace consultant in NASA's history." Naya had spent the previous evening practicing her presentation with Victoria and Emmanuel, rehearsing technical explanations and policy arguments that most graduate students would struggle to articulate. But as she looked out at the assembled lawmakers, Maya felt the same calm confidence that had carried her through her first outdoor flight test and her underwater training at Johnson Space Center, and honorable senators. Maya began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sound system. My name is Maya Ford, and I'm here to show you how flying wheelchairs can help astronauts explore the moon more safely and efficiently than any technology currently available. The demonstration that followed was unlike anything the Congressional Committee had ever witnessed. Maya piloted her flying wheelchair through a series of precise maneuvers that simulated lunar surface operations, explaining how the technology's intuitive controls and three-dimensional mobility capabilities would enhance astronaut productivity and safety. Traditional spacesuits are designed for walking, but the moon's low gravity makes walking inefficient and sometimes dangerous. Maya explained while hovering effortlessly above the conference room floor. Flying wheelchairs allow astronauts to move in 3 dimensions, carry heavy equipment, and access areas that would be impossible to reach on foot. Senator Robert Chen of California leaned forward with obvious interest. Ms. Ford, can you explain how this technology addresses the specific challenges that have been delaying the Artemis program? Maya had been preparing for this exact question throughout her months of NASA training. The main problem is that astronauts spend too much time and energy just moving around the lunar surface. With flying wheelchairs, they can focus on exploration and construction instead of struggling with mobility. Plus, if someone gets injured or their equipment fails, flying wheelchairs can perform rescue operations that would be impossible with traditional spacesuits. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts asked the question that everyone in the room was considering. This technology is impressive, but what's the realistic timeline for implementing it in actual space missions? And what are the costs compared to existing mobility systems? In Victoria stood to address the technical and budgetary aspects of the flying wheelchair program. Senator Warren, we estimate that flying wheelchair technology can be fully integrated into Artemis missions within 18 months, at a cost that's approximately 60% of current spacesuit development expenses. The efficiency gains from enhanced mobility will actually reduce overall mission costs while dramatically increasing scientific productivity. Emmanuel had been documenting the congressional demonstration with quiet pride, watching his daughter address some of the most powerful people in America with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to her flying practice sessions. The transformation from struggling disabled child to confident aerospace consultant had been gradual enough that he sometimes forgot how extraordinary Maya's journey had been. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida posed the question that cut to the heart of the political considerations surrounding the Artemis program. Ms. Ford, why should American taxpayers invest in lunar exploration when we have so many problems here on Earth that need attention and resources? Naya had been anticipating this challenge, and her response reflected months of thinking about the broader implications of space exploration and technological innovation. Senator Rubio, everything that helped me learn to fly also helps kids with disabilities here on Earth. The technology we're developing for astronauts is the same technology that gives children like me the freedom to explore and participate in activities that used to be impossible. Space exploration doesn't take resources away from solving Earth problems. It creates new solutions that benefit everyone. The committee members exchanged glances that suggested Maya's answer had reframed their understanding of the relationship between space exploration and domestic priorities. Here was a child who embodied the connection between advancing human capabilities in space and improving life for people with disabilities on Earth. And Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona asked the final substantive question of the hearing. What happens next if this committee approves increased funding for the Artemis program and flying wheelchair integration? What does success look like 5 years from now? Maya's answer revealed the scope of her vision for the future of both space exploration and disability rights. In 5 years, I want to see astronauts using flying wheelchairs to build permanent bases on the moon, and I want to see kids with disabilities using similar technology to participate fully in their communities here on Earth. I want flying to be normal for people who need it, whether they're exploring space or just trying to get to school. The formal hearing concluded with a unanimous vote to recommend full funding for Artemis program continuation with mandatory integration of flying wheelchair technology. But the most significant moment came after the cameras stopped rolling, when Senator Morrison approached Maya privately. "Young lady, you've given us something more valuable than just technology," the senator said quietly. "You've reminded us that innovation happens when we refuse to accept limitations, and that the best solutions often come from people who understand problems firsthand." Maya's response was characteristically direct. "Senator Morrison, the most important thing isn't the flying wheelchair or even the space program. It's proving that when families work together and communities support big dreams, impossible things become possible for everyone." The drive back to Houston that evening was subdued, with all 3 family members processing the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Maya had not only secured funding for the Artemis program, but had also established a new model for inclusive technology development that prioritized user needs over institutional preferences. NSIX months later, Maya stood on the observation deck at Johnson Space Center, watching Commander Chang and her crew prepare for the Artemis V mission that would carry flying wheelchair technology to the lunar surface. The space-rated mobility systems bore little resemblance to the primitive prototype that Emmanuel had built in his garage, but they carried the same spirit of refusing to accept limitations. "Mom, Dad," Maya said as they watched the rocket roll out to the launch pad. "Do you remember when I first asked if I could learn to fly?" Emmanuel smiled, remembering the therapy worksheet with "I want to fly" written in careful cursive. "I remember thinking it was impossible." "It was impossible," Maya corrected gently, "until we made it possible." NTHE Artemis V launch took place on a clear morning in September, carrying 3 astronauts and Maya's flying wheelchair technology toward humanity's return to the moon. As the rocket disappeared into the blue sky, Maya was already planning her next impossible dream, adapting flying wheelchair technology for Mars exploration. NBUT. More importantly, the Ford Family Foundation had begun manufacturing affordable flying wheelchairs for children with disabilities worldwide, ensuring that Maya's innovations would benefit families who couldn't afford custom aerospace engineering. Every child who learned to fly carried forward the same message that had started everything. When love meets determination and community support impossible dreams, the sky truly belongs to everyone brave enough to claim it. Maya Ford had wanted to fly, and in achieving that dream, she had taught the world that limitations were just engineering problems waiting for creative solutions. Her story became proof that sometimes the most extraordinary innovations come from the most ordinary desire to help someone you love experience the freedom they deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.